saying, who here has heard of mutual aid societies? Yeah? It's something that used to be really common in the United States, and they went out of style, although they do still exist, but they're kind of just in a diminished form now. But they used to be one of the main ways that communities provided for our needs, especially before the federal safety net programs like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security came online in the 1920s and 30s. Mutual aid societies were how communities pooled resources to take care of each other. And I've actually been reading this incredible book called Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. This is a really wonderful book. The author, Jessica Gordon Nemberd, is up at the University of New York, and this is a deep history of African American cooperative economics going all the way back to the 1600s. But she talks in here about how African American mutual aid societies especially became a big thing in Jim Crow era, right after slavery was abolished. And then actually what happened is that African Americans were denied access to land ownership and self-determination by the white supremacist-owned banks, who just refused to loan money to African Americans to be able to buy property and do all the things that they needed to do. And so what happened is that all these African American mutual aid societies were formed, and they started pooling resources, first informally and then by starting their own banks. And those later became credit unions when credit unions became a federal chartered institution, and those banks and credit unions were used to loan money to start hospitals, to buy blocks of houses in cities, to buy land for farms, to start schools and leadership training initiatives. So those kind of credit unions became these economic heartbeats of the social and political organizing, and then combined with churches, those are what led up into the ability to organize a civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And so it's kind of like that economic collaboration is what let communities take care of our basic needs. And then it created more cultural glue and trust and togetherness that allowed for political organizing. And this is also big in, there are Latin American mutual aid societies in the US called mutualistas. And every, basically every immigrant population ends up forming something like this. All the marginalized groups who are denied access to resources and power in the institutional framework of this country have used mutual aid organizing to lift themselves up and develop power base. And so I got interested in this about 4 or 5 years ago. I've been working in the field of what's called permaculture, which is it's an ecological design approach to a lot of the issues that we're facing in the world, things like climate change and food quality, but also permaculture is a really holistic framework that looks at how is land use and farming connected to social issues and political issues and economic issues, and how can we kind of design a future for ourselves that is meeting human needs a lot better than we are now, because our country is not doing a great job in that regard right now, right? So I've been working as a consultant for communities and landowners, as an educator, developing different leadership training around permaculture stuff. And I started about 4 or 5 years ago reading about mutual aid societies and the history of them, because my perception is that we just haven't had enough impact. The social change movement, especially since the civil rights movement was this big peak, Americans, we've basically become complacent. This is my personal opinion and analysis, right? We've basically become complacent, and we haven't had a really transformative social change movement since the civil rights movement. And we've still got a lot of the exact same issues that we had then, plus a bunch of other ones. And so my personal analysis is we're not having enough impact. How do we scale this thing up? How do we get together and work together more effectively? I started reading about mutual aid societies. You know, 1/3 to 1/2 of U.S. residents used to be members of mutual aid societies in the early 1900s, right? So it was a huge part of daily life. Like I said, mutual aid groups were running their own hospitals. And by the way, this is an origin of the healthcare crisis we're dealing with right now. All these mutual aid groups were running hospitals. They had contracts with doctors' associations who those doctors' associations were entirely composed of doctors working for mutual aid societies. And they had price negotiation, the mutual aid groups did, to keep healthcare costs low. Then all these private doctors' associations formed up, and they started lobbying state legislatures to essentially institute legislation that would make it hard for the mutual aid hospitals to continue. They did things like created expensive building codes that put mutual aid hospitals out of business, so that then the private doctors groups could get rid of the mutual aid doctors groups and raise healthcare costs. And that legacy of a loss of the ability to negotiate healthcare costs is what we're now dealing with in a runaway form. So this is one of the things that we're looking at, is how do we bring back the ability through scale of collaboration, to get enough people together that we actually have negotiating power with some of these kind of large entities and dynamics that we're facing right now. Right? We were just at this meeting of Down Home, North Carolina, my dad and I, and some of you were there in Silva Thursday night, and they were talking about the whole new Medicaid expansion in North Carolina, the thing that's going on, right? And what's going to happen right now, the way it's set up, is the only the healthcare providers who are going to put in contracts for fulfilling Medicaid expansion are private companies, right? Or it's Blue Cross Blue Shield, etc. They're profit-driven companies who their main motive is making money off of healthcare, not providing healthcare to people, right? And so what that's going to set us up for is a whole, if we get the Medicaid expansion funds, that money is going to end up applied through the same profit-driven mechanisms that healthcare is applied through today, and we don't have negotiating power. Well, what if we had a healthcare cooperative, which has been done throughout the U.S. and in other countries too? There was a woman at the meeting who is part of a healthcare co-op in South Korea, right? Healthcare cooperatives are groups that are focused on providing quality healthcare to their members rather than making profit. What if we had one of those going in North Carolina that could put in proposals to the state for the Medicaid expansion money and take that federal money and apply it efficiently to actually provide high quality healthcare instead of making profit for a healthcare company, for a health insurance company, right? So that's that's kind of mutual aid thinking. So this is just painting some examples and some of the history. And by the way, in this book, she goes into the last third of the book is her kind of assessment of what the future of collaborative economics in the U.S. can look like, learning from the history of the past and some of the mistakes that have been made and stuff. So the organization that myself and a team are in the process of forming, we're calling it CooperateWNC. And it's a mutual aid organization. There's actually an IRS tax designation for mutual aid societies, 501c8 organizations. We're forming a 501c3, a kind of a typical nonprofit just to get started, but a 501c8 we're going to apply for after we get going, and that's for the express purpose of providing benefits for members, like healthcare. That was one of the typical benefits provided for mutual aid society members. But what CooperateWNC is, the vision of this thing is using collaborative economics, so different forms of collaborative economics. For instance, forming our own credit union, just like the history of mutual aid societies in the U.S. have done, right? A credit union being a federally chartered bank that has the benefit of, we could all in this room pool our money together informally into a savings account and choose to make loans to each other. And a lot of people are doing that in this country, right? Making what are called savings pools. And that's one of the things that we do need to start doing more to get going. But the problem with that is if you make if someone brings a proposal and says, I want to start a school that's going to serve the youth in our community with better education than we are currently getting through the public system. And everyone says, oh yeah, we want to invest in that. And then you invest your savings pool money in it, and then the whole thing flops. Your money's just gone, right? Whereas with a federally chartered credit union, the money is backed up by the federal banking system, essentially. Just like banks are insured through the FDIC, there's a similar institution. So if we start a credit union at Western North Carolina scale, that gives us insurance, essentially, so that we could all take our money out of the other banks that we're in right now, who are investing their money in all kinds of stuff that most of us probably don't believe in, and have our own credit union that we get to democratically choose what projects in our communities to invest in. And that becomes an economic heartbeat, just like it has historically in the US, for investing in the things that we decide that we need. Right? So that's one of the big core of the vision of this CooperateWNC is a Western North Carolina scale credit union, or working with self-help credit union, which I have a meeting with Jane Hatley, who's the director of the Western branch of self-help credit union, which is a great mission-driven credit union. I have a meeting with her in 2 weeks to talk about working together, and then using collaborative economics to support a network of community centers throughout Western North Carolina, physical community centers. In a lot of cases, that's going to be working with existing community centers, right? People who are already doing stuff. For instance, the NAACP, right? It's like what groups are already working on these issues, already trying to lift ourselves up, just working with that, and then saying we can support your existing efforts with the networking and collaborative economics and the information sharing of the mutual aid network of CooperateWNC. So that's what we're looking at, is helping to support a network of community centers that become focal points for providing services, human services, like healthcare, childcare, food access, educational events, stuff like that, right? And then those places become these organizing focal points for also getting ourselves together politically a little more coherently, and for taking action on climate change is a big part of this effort, actually, is how do we organize at a meaningful scale to respond to climate change, understanding that is connected with, intersectional with these other challenges we're facing around healthcare access and kind of the political environment that we're in. So that's kind of the nutshell vision, right? Is using collaborative economics to support a network of regional community centers. And there's so many details we could go into on this around forming a healthcare cooperative, which is also a part of the vision, forming a North Carolina healthcare cooperative, and a regional carbon association, which has to do with the climate change piece, and some food access and so on. But I just want to lay that out to start with and see if there are any first layer questions or responses to that from you all. Yeah.
You know, one thing that occurs to me that this could be pretty useful for is the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, I think of Bernie Sanders taking people up to Canada to be able to get medicine at a better price. Well,
yeah.
Obviously we're too far away from that, but maybe through a cooperative venture like you're describing, there might be some avenue for getting medicines at a reduced price. And that's one possibility.
Yeah. Right. Again, the power to negotiate.
Right.
If you have 100 people, the pharmaceutical industry just doesn't care. And hospitals don't either, right? They don't care. But if you have 10,000 people and all of the economic force that represents, then they start to care. And that's definitely a big piece.
Your website again?
Yeah, it's WNC-mutual-aid.org.
You mentioned one called CooperateWNC.
The organization is called CooperateWNC, but the website, which is a little confusing, so we're working to align that. We just came up with the name CooperateWNC about 2.5 months ago, so we had already gotten the web together at that point.
Could you repeat the website,
Yeah,
please?
WNC-mutual-aid.org. We also have a Facebook page, which is CooperateWNC, and we started a podcast, the Mutual Aid Podcast, which is the first episode of that is up online if any of you care to listen to that. Yeah. Other points or discussion on that? Yeah.
Two questions. One, obviously there's a long history behind this.
Yeah.
It's encouraging that there's a basis in African American history for this collective courage. I'll just pass it around to circulate that. So I'm wondering if, the first question I have is, what lessons have you picked up historically to make sure that an organization like this and whatever gets spawned out of it is going to be economically inclusive in the sense that you're going to address the huge disparities, for instance, with African Americans, with immigrant communities, with Native folks over there? That's the first question.
Thank you.
The other question is that we, as the NAACP, is an advocacy organization primarily. We're not an economic organization. But what we can do is that we can advocate for economic policies.
Right.
I'm wondering if you are seeing any legal or political obstacles that would keep you from spawning this mutual aid organizations, and is there a way in which we can insert ourselves into? So that's two very complicated questions. So.
No, that's great. Thank you. All right. So the first one about inclusivity. Yeah. So it's interesting because most mutual aid organizations in the past of the U.S. have been based on ethnic or cultural identity. Right. There have been African American mutual aid societies, Latin American ones, Jewish ones, Arab ones. They've been based on that identity. And in this one, we're coming along with a new generation of mutual aid initiatives. We're not the only one that are basing an identity on shared values rather than on racial or ethnic or cultural identity. But we recognize that that doesn't mean that it's going to eliminate, right? It's like the whole color blindness thing, right? Just saying that we're based on shared values doesn't mean that it's going to be equitable. So that's part of the challenge. And yeah, the three of us who are in the core group right now are all white. And we're saying we definitely don't want to set that pattern as to begin with. We want to get leadership and get perspective and get engagement from diverse communities. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here today and networking with diverse people. We're working with several different kind of advisors to get that down and connect with different communities. That's a little bit of a different question. Engagement with diverse communities is different than saying, how is it going to make sure to serve people from different economic needs and classes and from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds? Because that's a fact, is that we're going to end up with, are we going to end up with just a bunch of middle class people who don't actually need the help of a mutual aid society that much? That's a danger, right? And so what we're looking at, and the pattern from past mutual aid organizations, is that there has been active recruitment of people from a diverse range of the economic spectrum, and there has been variable rates of membership dues, so that people who have more pay more, and people who have less pay less or none in some cases. It's essentially like a microcosm of the like federal healthcare, the ACA or something, right? Where you get a subsidy for healthcare if you got low income, and then you get less subsidy the more income you make. So something like that, setting up a system like that, and that's still very much in the embryonic stages. Is what is that going to look like? But we're also seeking people to participate in leadership and working groups, just like you're recruiting committee members this morning. So we have a healthcare working group, right? And we have a credit union working group, and we're getting people involved to be working out the details of that, especially people who have expertise in those areas. Does that the first?
Yeah, that would be the first
layer?
one. So
Yeah, and then the legal barriers to what we're doing with the
because
second.
what we can do is that we can advocate.
Yeah.
For changes in policy, procedure,
Yeah.
or just the politics of tackling something of that scale.
Yeah. So my instinct is the answer to that is yes, there are barriers, and we haven't done the deep enough research into the existing legislative history of North Carolina to understand what they are. I've read in her book that I passed around about there was this coordinated campaign, in the 1920s to put mutual aid societies out of business by the private doctors associations, for example, but I haven't gotten into the nitty-gritty of exactly what all laws were instituted and which ones are still in the books. And so that's a whole research project, is to understand the North Carolina legal context of this and what the barriers are and which enemies are likely to arise to this as we become successful. Because we are talking about, frankly, putting private insurance businesses out of business, and probably some banks too. and because those are not positive forces. A lot of the banking institutions right now are reinforcing all of the things that are keeping our communities oppressed and leading to catastrophic climate change, frankly. And so those institutions are either going to have to change dramatically, or we're going to have to replace them and put them out of business. Yeah.
Well, let's see, has it been considered that, for instance, if workers could be brought together, this is a difficult thing because it just hasn't really worked too well. Black and white and all workers could be brought together and recognize that their needs are the same. And the same thing would be true of seniors, because the majority of seniors are not wealthy.
Yeah.
They're mostly on fixed income, and those are two groups. If they could be brought together to recognize that they have the same values, the same needs, this would work. Now, I don't know how you would do it, because we worked on this for a long time, and tried to get all the workers, black and white, to understand that, hey, we have the same, we're the same needs, the same problems. If that can be done, you'll have it made.
What happened when you tried?
Well, let's see, I know I, for one, got booed a few times, and got asked, well, what do you mean? And I very, very clearly said, look, you're a white guy, you're working, right? You have to work to pay your bills, to make a living. You have to work, right?
Yeah.
This is a black guy or black woman who's working for the same reason. So you come together and you work together and you can get further away. This is, of course, how they managed to get some unions going.
Yeah.
And they started falling apart because this was kind of, they started saying, oh, well, no, you're not really and you're not this.
Right.
And we worked very hard at that. And I know I worked getting a couple of unions together. I was with one that was working 1199, for instance. We helped to get that together because, hey, all of you have the same problems, the same needs.
Yeah.
And it was as if they couldn't understand that. And I got together, they had me speaking, and of course I get very, I really get going with it. And we got some, finally said, that's true. And this is how some of these things work. And if that could be done now, because there's the separation.
Yeah.
If that could be done now to make everybody who's got to work in order to make a living, in order to live, hey, we have the same problems that I have.
Yeah.
We all have the same problems. If we get together, we can solve the problems.
Yeah.
Hey?
Well, that reminds me of the listening project that Down Home, North Carolina just completed. Which, for any of you who aren't familiar with Down Home, North Carolina, it's this really interesting organization that has they have a Jackson County office, right?
No, the office is in Canton.
It's in Canton, okay.
But they have an organization here in Jackson County.
Okay, so
they have
active
come
then.
and talked to. They have come and talked to us about.
Oh, great. Okay, so in that report, they just, Selma, speaking to what you're pointing out, the common needs. They they interviewed 1,400 people throughout North Carolina, mostly lower income people, and tried to understand the needs that were most present and unmet, and as a place for them to take off in terms of their action as an organization. And the top need they found was healthcare, right? Not that surprising. And then there were about 12 other categories that people kind of voted on or expressed their opinions on in the listening project. And so going along with that, that's, I think, in my opinion, the way that we engage with diverse people is through a language of their needs. What do you truly need?
What are the top?
Exactly.
Because Medicare isn't really doing it.
It's not doing it, right?
It's not doing it, and healthcare, I know personally, because my expenses are going crazy.
Yeah.
And I'm a senior, I'm 87 years old, and there are countries where I wouldn't have to worry about medical. But this is the one country that even 87 you have to worry about paying for.
Yeah.
This is the only country, and I've traveled in a lot of them and been taken care, and this is it.
Yeah.
And that's what people need to understand. Healthcare is the need
Yeah.
of all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
A lot.
it's not happening because Medicare is not doing it.
Yeah, right. So if we could, for instance, set up a healthcare cooperative that was at a scale and organized well and able to provide healthcare lower cost and higher quality because it's not driven by profit but rather by the motive of providing healthcare, then that starts to get people engaged because it's meeting a deep need. And by the way, hopefully, in my opinion, we get single payer healthcare in this country. But if we set up a healthcare cooperative, it could be set up in a way so as to receive federal funding from single payer and then be a regional administrator of a federal single payer system. So, all right, back there, Enrique, yeah.
Just another observation, I think what happens in certain places like Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina, there's a regional recognition that at the state level, the state government doesn't necessarily pay enough attention to that portion, whether it be Eastern Tennessee or Western North Carolina.
Yeah.
And there have been movements in the past that have tried to have independence from the state to try to create more responsive government.
Yeah.
But I think what your approach is doing is by calling yourself Cooperative or Cooperate WNC, then you're recognizing a avenue for having people open up to the idea of this kind of cooperative and mutualistic approach, because it's not something that would raise the hackles of anybody in the western part of North Carolina unless they were so bound to the central part that it did create a problem. But I think the regional approach is not bad. It can't be used everywhere, but in certain areas it can.
Interesting. Oh, and speaking of that, I'll pass around this other book, and then I know Enrique wanted to say something. This is a book about Mondrian, which is a region or an area in the Basque region of Spain, and they have probably the most successful cooperative, regional scale cooperative economic history of any place in the world. There are 70,000 members of this Mondragon collective, which is called itself a cooperative of cooperatives. They have over 100 businesses, entire towns, a healthcare system, social safety net system, as well as a bunch of kind of informal cultural ways of taking care of each other and working together. And this has been going on since, I believe, the 1940s there. So this is, for me, a model of a regional scale thing. Maybe Western North Carolina is an analogous thing. This is this mountainous region in Spain and all that. There are a lot of comparisons to make there. So I'll pass this one around too. What were you going to say, Enrique?
Well, actually, the question was immediately about this, because I was scanning the book titles, and of course, in Latin American countries, we often talk about the Mondragon Collective as being one successful model, mainly because of the longevity. And I'm wondering, where does the longevity of something like this comes from? Does it come from simply the scale, the number of members that are part of this? Is there a particular economic model that they have implemented that has been resilient, that have helped the cooperative work for a long, long time? And I'm wondering, what do you see here that could potentially, as an economic project, what would be the things that you would see? Yeah. Because right now our economy is based upon tourism, the healthcare industry, is the gambling. We have education here, and that's essentially pretty much it. Local manufacturing is in the decline. Is there something that you see locally that potentially could be sustainable, especially since you're trying to address something having to do with climate change resiliency? Yeah. All right. He's asking the big questions. So Mondragon. I mean. Right, we could spend 3 hours talking just about Mondragon and what they are, but they, the history of it is that they created this cooperative. There was this, I think he was a friar, actually. He was in the clergy, who during the fascist political regime in Spain, there was this crisis moment going on, and they were dealing with extremely high unemployment. It was like 35 or 40% unemployment in this region of Spain. And so it was a moment of opportunity when people were suffering a lot and having a lot of needs really deeply unmet
And I think that's the similarity that we have right now to the moment when Mondragon was created, is that we have a crisis moment going on, really. It's a slow motion catastrophe that's going on in our culture, including in our region right now for a lot of people. And so they had an economic system that was dependent on exploitation in Mondragon as well, in the vast region of Spain. And we have that same thing, right? We don't have that base of a self-sufficient, self-reliant economy going on in Western North Carolina. It's always depended on, like Enrique was saying, tourism, wealthy people using this as a second home, or exploitative resource extraction, like with logging, right? The whole region being logged multiple times to extract the logs, or with coal mining, or with mica mining from, right, the Silva, Dillsboro area. And so that's a great question. What is kind of, we have this word in permaculture called regenerative, right? Regenerative, it means something that can continue being, regenerating itself rather than being exploited once and then it's gone, like logs or oil, right? So what's a regenerative economic set of economic industries for this region? And there are a lot of people working on that from a lot of different directions. My opinion is that we do have some, and they're mostly based in the ecosystem here and things that can be produced. Forestry products, medicinal products. They're native forest medicinals that are bought all around the world from Western North Carolina right now that grow really well here. Things that can be produced in a long term while improving the ecosystem rather than destroying the ecosystem, like through clear-cut logging. I think that's part of the answer. And I don't know the whole answer to it though, and it's a deep question, and I think that we need to be putting a lot of attention on it. Yeah. Did we get the whole question?
I think so, yeah.
How are we doing on time?
What we're doing over there is 11:48. Yeah, it's not bad.
I'm just passing around a couple more books while we're at it. This is another one that's the history, more general history of mutual aid in the United States. This one is called Sacred Economics, and it's by a guy who lives in Asheville, Charles Eisenstein. And this is about a lot of pretty radical economic ideas for reshaping our economic system to be more of a gift economy, something that's based on taking care of each other because of relationships, human relationships, rather than just transactional relationships. So this, if you want to get deep into it, check that one out. And then this one is the guy who basically invented the term mutual aid, and it's a really fascinating read. He was Russian, and he was writing he was living in the United Kingdom in the late 1800s, and he was basically saying, if you look at life all around us, non-human life, that life cooperates more than it competes, but that the people, the rich white guys in Britain who were starting the Industrial Revolution wanted everyone to believe that life was about competition and dog eat dog, because then they could justify their economics and oppressing everybody and forcing everyone to work low wage in factories. And so they worked with Charles Darwin's ideas, theory of evolution, and said, Darwin said that life is about survival of the fittest. Actually, Charles Darwin's own observations proved that life is more often about cooperation than competition, but the industrialists in Britain cherry-picked his information and just chose the competitive examples. This book by Kropotkin goes through all of biological systems, talking about how animals and plants work together more than they compete, and then he goes through human cultures and the history of human cultures and all of the different types of mutual aid that we've used, all of our ancestors and all of the continents for thousands of years to collaborate and take care of each other more than compete. So it's saying that that's the basis for for a successful culture. And then this is a recent one that's by this woman, Elizabeth Catt. It's called What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia. And it's a really interesting, she published it right after Trump got into office, about challenging the typical media story of Appalachian politics and she's saying that there's actually a lot more going on in Appalachia than just to say it, coarsely ignorant white people voting for Trump. She's saying there's a lot of subtlety to what has led to the conditions that we're in, and there's a lot of political and cultural diversity that doesn't get shown in the media in Southern Appalachia. And so she's highlighting some of those stories that have been hidden in this book. So that's a really good one.
She wrote as a counterpoint to Hillbilly Eulogy, I believe. That has become now the quote-unquote Bible of white middle-class intellectuals from the North understanding quote-unquote Trump country. But,
yeah. So we literally just are getting going this year in the last 5 months as an organization. I've been beginning to work on it full time, and what we're doing, like we have a visioning retreat when forming our board and the nonprofit and everything in a week and a half, and we're getting working groups together to work on the various dimensions of this. It's obviously going to be a long-term project that takes a lot of people with a lot of different expertise. We really want to have diverse leadership, diverse in terms of racial and cultural backgrounds, but also in terms of economic backgrounds and also in terms of skill sets. And so if any of y'all are interested in, you can first of all check out all the web resources, our website, Facebook page, podcast. We have a Patreon campaign, which is a crowdfunding campaign that's raising money for what we're doing. But also we can really just use help with getting involved in our working groups. So I'm going to send around a piece of paper right now. You can put your email on it. We have a newsletter that's going to be going out once a month, so you can stay informed that way at the base level. But also there's a column here to write if you're interested in getting involved in any working groups. You can just mention that here, and I'll follow up with you after this meeting. And if there are any other questions, or we can adjourn.
Other questions?
Just a suggestion.
Yes, thank you.
But it's not for you, it's for Enrique.
Yeah.
And that is, these books are pretty useful. I didn't bring a pencil to write things down. So what would be good though, is that if on the website, this chapter, we could put that information. I know that Enrique has been writing diligently, but I think a couple books passed him by before he took down their titles. If nothing else, the title and the author would be useful to have on the website, so that if we want to go back and say, gee, I'd like to read more, that would be useful, Enrique.
I think I got most of them for
Okay,
minutes. I
good.
got 5 books.
Yeah. I got the names. It might be 6 actually with the Elizabeth Cat book. Yeah, 6, yeah. Oh, thanks. And that reminds me, I wanted to say one more thing too. I mentioned a little savings pools. Has anyone here heard of or participated in a savings pool? It's this thing they're doing. They do it a lot in so-called developing countries. They're doing it in New Zealand a lot. So a savings pool is an informal economic collaborative tool that is basically like 10 of us in this room. We get together once a month. It could be for some other purpose too. It might happen at the NAACP meeting. It can be integrated in with other functions. Every person puts in, you decide, we each put in $10 a month. We each put in $50 a month. There's some in New Zealand where each person is putting in $500 a month. That creates a savings pool. And that's what it is. It's a savings pool. You're saving your own money, but you're making it available. Then people within the group can come in and put a proposal in. Oh, I need $10,000 to start this business. Or I want to pay off my car loan so that I'm not paying interest anymore. Or there's some cases in New Zealand, colleagues of mine who are paying off a house mortgage loan. So then, of course, if you could pay off a house mortgage in real time, you might end up paying $180,000 for a house rather than $300,000 for a house, right? Over the lifetime of that mortgage. So you pay that off from that savings pool, and then the person who took the loan out then begins paying that money back in with an overage rate. So it might be that if I borrowed $10,000, I would pay $15,000 back total. But I'm not giving that $5,000 away as if I were paying interest. that money is still my money. And once I'm done paying my loan back, I can take that money out at any time like it's a savings account, right? So it's just a way of pooling money, incentivizing savings, right? By you now have accountability to a group because you're telling the group, I'm going to put in this much each month. So it's a way of kind of getting yourself to save money, right? And then it starts to form the ability for people in that group to get stuff done, to get projects going that might be beyond our capacity normally, right? It also starts to make trust and kind of cultural glue. So this is what one of the early stages. It's going to take a long time, it's going to take years to form a credit union, for instance, like we want to do. But in the short term, we're encouraging, and I myself, where I live down in Rutherford County, we're in the process of starting a savings pool ourselves, right? To get a bunch of us going with savings pools, if and where that makes sense. And that's going to just enhance our ability to fund our community initiatives at kind of a slightly larger scale. And then once we can get a credit union going, then we'll already have those savings pools. We can put that money into the credit union altogether if we choose, obviously, and that becomes the seed of the credit union funding pool. So if you want to learn more about that, there's a game actually. It's been developed by people in New Zealand. It's a game that just allows you to play out a savings pool, how it works over time, and get a feel for it, because some of us tend to be uncomfortable with the idea of putting our money into a common pool, right? And if you want to learn a little bit more about that, we could set up another presentation in the future where we could come and do that, for instance. And again, it makes sense to me that we would work with existing groups. I heard you say that NAACP is advocacy, not a financial organization. At the same time, though, if you're all getting together anyway and you're all working together and getting to know each other, it could be a good format to start a savings pool within, right? And then you don't have to go to another meeting every month. You just go to the same meeting each month and do it there, right? So yeah.
So how would that be administered? I mean,
yeah,
you're not just going to keep all that cash in a pillowcase,
right?
That would be deposited in a bank.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right. It'd be deposited in a bank. You just put it in a checking or savings account in a bank.
Okay.
That's it. It can even be done under the auspices of the 501c3. I'm assuming you have a 501. This isn't a 501c3.
This is a 501c4. We're
C4. Okay.
501c3. The overall national organization is considered a 501c3.
Okay. Yeah. So we'd have to look into the legal details of that a little bit, but.
Okay. So is that going around? Okay.
So thank you all for
let's give
your
Zev a
time.
hand.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.